You've heard the myths of the gods and goddesses, priests and kings and mighty men. Fantastical. Excellent for movies and media. But what about truth? What are the roots of these myths? All myth is rooted in truth. This book digs right to those roots. These are European historical records that mount up to 2,000 years before Christ, equaling those of Israel, covering idol worship, the 3-year burning and flooding that destroyed and buried many nations, how the Greek gods came to be, and centering on survivors of the submersion of Atlantis and many other nations, and the upright people called the Frisians, in particular Frya and her people, a people that believed in the one God who they called Wr-alda. Sit back and listen, and get ready to relearn history. Before we begin, please be sure to subscribe, like, and comment.
Introduction to the Oera Linda Book by William R. Sandbach. 1876. C. Wr-alda Linden, Chief Superintendent of the Royal Dockyard at the Helder, possesses a very ancient manuscript, which has been inherited and preserved in his family from time immemorial, without anyone knowing whence it came or what it contained, owing to both the language and the writing being unknown. All that was known was that a tradition contained in it had from generation to generation been recommended to careful preservation. It appeared that the tradition rests upon the contents of 2 letters, with which the manuscript begins, from Hiddo Oera Linda, anno 1256, and from Lico Oera Linda, anno 803. It came to see Wr-alda Linden by the directions of his grandfather, den Heer Andries Wr-alda Linden, who lived at Enkhuizen and died there on the 15th of April 1820, aged 61. As the grandson was at that time barely 10 years old, the manuscript was taken care of for him by his aunt, Afja Maelhoff, born Wr-alda Linden, living at Enkhuizen, who in August 1848 delivered it to the present possessor. Dr. E. Verwijs, having heard of this, requested permission to examine the manuscript, and immediately recognized it as very ancient Frise. He obtained at the same time permission to make a copy of it, for the benefit of the Friesland Society, and was of opinion that it might be of great importance, provided it was not supposititious, and invented for some deceptive object which he feared. The manuscript being placed in my hands, I also felt very doubtful, though I could not understand what object anyone could have in inventing a false composition, only to keep it a secret. This doubt remained until I had examined carefully executed facsimiles of 2 fragments, and afterwards of the whole manuscript, the first sight of which convinced me of the great age of the document. Immediately occurred to me Caesar's remark upon the writing of the Gauls and the Helvetians in his Bello Gallico, Graecis utuntur litteris, though it appears in verse 48 that they were not entirely Greek letters. Caesar thus points out only a resemblance, and a very true one. As the writing, which does not altogether correspond with any known form of letters, resembles the most, on a cursory view, the Greek writing, such as is found on monuments and the oldest manuscripts, and belongs to the form which is called lapidary. Besides, I formed the opinion afterwards that the writer of the latter part of the book had been a contemporary of Caesar. The form and the origin of the writing is so minutely and fully described in the first part of the book, as it could not be in any other language. It is very complete, and consists of 34 letters, among which are 3 separate forms of A and U and 2 of E, I, Y, and O, besides 4 pairs of double consonants, NG, TH, HS, and GS. The paper, of large quarto size, is made of cotton, not very thick, without watermark or maker's mark, made upon a frame or wire web, with not very broad perpendicular lines. An introductory letter gives the year 1256, as that in which this manuscript was written by Hiddo Oera Linda on foreign paper. Consequently, it must have come from Spain, where the Arabs brought into the market paper manufactured from cotton. On this subject, Wr-alda writes, "The manufacture of paper from cotton must have been in use among the Chinese from very remote times, and must have become known to the Arabs by the conquest of Samarkand, about the year 704. In Damascus, this manufacture was an important branch of industry, for which reason it was called Charta Damascena. By the Arabians, this art was brought to the Greeks. It is asserted that Greek manuscripts of the 10th century, written upon cotton paper, exist, and that in the 13th century it was much more used than parchment. To distinguish it from Egyptian paper, it was called Charta Bombacina, Gossipina, Kutunea, Selina. A distinction from linen paper was not yet necessary. In the manufacture of the cotton paper, raw cotton was originally used. We first find paper from rags mentioned by Petrus Clusius Census, 1122–50. The Spaniards and the Italians learned the manufacture of this paper from the Arabians. The most celebrated factories were at Jativa, Valencia, Toledo, besides Fabriano in the March of Ancona. In Germany, the use of this material did not become very extended, whether it came from Italy or Spain. Therefore, the further this preparation spread from the East and the adjoining countries, the more necessity there was that linen should take the place of cotton. A document of Kaufbeuren on linen paper of the year 1318 is of very doubtful genuineness. Bodman considers the oldest pure linen paper to be of the year 1324, but up to 1350, much mixed paper was used. All carefully written manuscripts of great antiquity show by the regularity of their lines that they must have been ruled, even though no traces of the ruled lines can be distinguished. To make the lines, they used a thin piece of lead, a ruler, and a pair of compasses to mark the distances. In old writings, the ink is very black or brown, but while there has been more writing since the 13th century, the color of the ink is often gray or yellowish, and sometimes quite pale, showing that it contains iron. All this affords convincing proof that the manuscript before us belongs to the middle of the 13th century, written with clear black letters between fine lines, carefully traced with lead. The color of the ink shows decidedly that it does not contain iron. By these evidences, the date given, 1256, is satisfactorily proved, and it is impossible to assign any later date. Therefore, all suspicion of modern deception vanishes. The language is very old Frise, still older and purer than the Frise Ruchtbook, or Old Frise laws, differing from that both in form and spelling, so that it appears to be an entirely distinct dialect, and shows that the locality of the language must have been, as it was spoken, between the Vlaai and the Scheldt. The style is extremely simple, concise, and unembarrassed, resembling that of ordinary conversation, and free in the choice of the words. The spelling is also simple and easy, so that the reading of it does not involve the least difficulty. And yet, with all its regularity, so unrestricted, that each of the separate writers who have worked at the book has his own peculiarities, arising from the changes in pronunciation in a long course of years, which naturally must have happened, as the last part of the work is written 5 centuries after the first. As a specimen of antiquity in language and writing, I believe I may venture to say that this book is unique of its kind. The writing suggests an observation which may be of great importance. The Greeks know and acknowledge that their writing was not their own invention. They attribute the introduction of it to Cadmus, a Phoenician. The names of their oldest letters, from alpha to tau, agree so exactly with the names of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet, with which the Phoenician will have been nearly connected, that we cannot doubt that the Hebrew was the origin of the Phoenician. But the form of their letters differs so entirely from that of the Phoenician and Hebrew writing, that in that particular, No connection can be thought of between them. Whence, then, have the Greeks derived the form of their letters? From Thet Bok Thera, Adele Folstar, the Book of Adele's followers, we learn that in the time when Cadmus is said to have lived, about 16 centuries before Christ, a brisk trade existed between the Frisians and the Phoenicians, whom they named Kadamar, or dwellers on the coast. The name Cadmus comes too near the word Kadamar for us not to believe that Cadmus simply meant a Phoenician. Further on, we learn that about the same time a priestess of the castle in the island of Walcheren, Minerva, also called Nehelenia, had settled in Attica at the head of a Frisian colony, and had founded a castle at Athens. Also, from the accounts written on the walls of Wr-alda, that the Finns likewise had a writing of their own, a very troublesome and difficult one to read. And that therefore the Tyrians and the Greeks had learned the writing of Frya by this representation. The whole thing explains itself, and it becomes clear whence comes the exterior resemblance between the Greek and the old Frese writing, which Caesar also remarked among the Gauls, as likewise in what manner the Greeks acquired and retained the names of the Finn and the forms of the Frese writing. Equally remarkable are the forms of their figures. We usually call our figures Arabian, although they have not the least resemblance to those used by the Arabs. The Arabians did not bring their ciphers from the East, because the Semitic nations used the whole alphabet in writing numbers. The manner of expressing all numbers by 10 signs the Arabs learned in the West, though the form was in some measure corresponding with their writing, and was written from left to right, after the Western fashion. Our ciphers seem here to have sprung from the Frese ciphers, which form had the same origin as the handwriting, and is derived from the lines of the jewel. The book, as it lies before us, consists of 2 parts, differing widely from each other, and of dates very far apart. The writer of the first part calls herself Adela, wife of Apol, chief man of the Linda country. This is continued by her son Adelbrost and her daughter Apollonia. The first book is written by Adele. The following part is begun by Adelbrost and continued by Apollonia. The second book is written by Apollonia, much later, perhaps 250 years. A third book is written by Fret Horic. Then follows written by his widow, Wiljo. After that, by their son, Conored, and then by their grandson, Bedon. The last part is wanting. Therefore the writer is unknown. He may probably have been a son of Bedon. To fix the date, we must start from the year 1256 of our era, when Oera Linda made the copy, in which he says that it was 3,449 years after Atlant was sunk. This disappearance of the old land, Aldland, Otland, was known by the Greeks, for Plato mentions in his Timaeus the disappearance of Atlantis, the position of which was only known as somewhere far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. From this writing it appears that it was land stretching far out to the west of Jutland, of which Heligoland and the islands of North Friesland are the last barren remnants. This event, which occasioned a great dispersion of the Frisian race, became the commencement of a chronological reckoning, corresponding with 2193 before Christ, and is known by geologists as the Cimbrian flood. Frethor-ic, the first writer, was a contemporary of the occurrences which he relates, namely, the arrival of Friso. He was a friend of Ludgert den Geertman, who, as rear admiral of the fleet of Vichhirta, the Sea King, had come with Friso in the year 303 before Christ, 1,890 years after the disappearance of Atland. He has borrowed most of his information from the logbook of Ludgert. The last writer gives himself out, most clearly, as a contemporary of Black Adele, or Askar, about the middle of his reign, which Firmarius states to have been from 70 before Christ to 11 after the birth of Christ, the same period as Julius Caesar and Augustus. He therefore wrote in the middle of the last century before Christ, and knew of the conquest of Gaul by the Romans. It is thus evident that there elapsed fully 2 centuries between the two parts of the work. Of the Gauls, we read that they were called the missionaries of Sidon, and that the Gauls are Druids. The Gauls, then, were Druids, and the name Galli, used for the whole nation, was really only the name of an order of priesthood brought from the East, just as among the Romans the Galli were priests of Cybele. The whole contents of the book are in all respects new. That is to say, there is nothing in it that we were acquainted with before. What we here read of Friso, Adele, and Ascar differs entirely from what is related by our own chroniclers, or rather presents it in quite another light. For instance, they all relate that Friso came from India, and that thus the Frisians were of Indian descent, and yet they add that Friso was a German, and belonged to a Persian race, which Herodotus called Germans. According to the statement in this book, Friso did come from India, and with the fleet of Nearchus, but he is not therefore an Indian. He is of Frisian origin, of Frya's people. He belongs, in fact, to a Frisian colony, which after the death of Nihilenia, 15.5 centuries before Christ, under the guidance of a priestess Geert, settled in the Panjab, and took the name of Geertmen. The Geertmen were known by only one of the Greek writers, Strabo, who mentions them as German, differing totally and entirely from the Brahmin in manners, language, and religion. The historians of Alexander's expeditions do not speak of Frisians or Geertmen, though they mention Indo-Scythians, thereby describing a people who live in India, but whose origin is in the distant, unknown north. In the accounts of Ludgert, no names are given of plains where the Frieslanders lived in India. We only know that they first established themselves to the east of the Punjab, and afterwards moved to the west of those rivers. It is mentioned, moreover, as a striking fact, that in the summer, the sun at midday was straight above their heads. They therefore lived within the tropics. We find in Ptolemy, exactly 24 degrees north on the west side of the Indus, the name Minagara, and about 6 degrees east of that, in 22 degrees north, another Minagara. This name is pure Frise, the same as Walhalagara and Folsgara, and comes from Minna, the name of an Iramotor in whose time the voyages of Tunis and his nephew Inca took place. The coincidence is too remarkable to be accidental, and not to prove that Minagara was the headquarters of the Frisian colony. The establishment of the colonists in the Punjab in 1551 before Christ, and their journey thither, we find fully described in Adele's book, and with the mention of one most remarkable circumstance, namely, that the Frisian mariners sailed through the strait, which in those times still ran into the Red Sea. In Strabo, Book 1, it appears that Eratosthenes was acquainted with the existence of the strait, of which the later geographers make no mention. It existed still in the time of Moses, Exodus 14:2, for he encamped at Pi-Hahiroth, the month of the strait. Moreover, Strabo mentions that Sesostris made an attempt to cut through the isthmus, but that he was not able to accomplish it. That in very remote times the sea really did flow through is proved by the result of the geological investigations on the isthmus made by the Suez Canal Commission, of which Monsieur Renaud presented a report to the Academy of Sciences on the 19th of June 1856. In that report, among other things, appears the following. A very controversial question is whether at the time when the Hebrews were fleeing Egypt, under the leadership of Moses, the Bitter Lakes were still part of the Red Sea. This last hypothesis would agree better than the opposite hypothesis with the text of the sacred books. But then it would be necessary to admit that since the time of Moses, the threshold of Suez would have risen from the waters. With regard to this question, it is certainly of importance to fall in with an account, in this Frisian manuscript, from which it seems that in the 16th century before Christ, the connection between the Bitter Lakes and the Red Sea still existed, and that the strait was still navigable. The manuscript further states that soon after the passage of the Geertman, there was an earthquake, that the land rose so high that all the water ran out, and all the shallows and alluvial lands rose up like a wall. This must have happened after the time of Moses, so that at the date of the Exodus, the track between Suez and the Bitter Lakes was still navigable, but could be forded dry foot at low water. This point, then, is the commencement of the isthmus, after the forming of which, the northern inlet was certainly soon filled up, as far as the Gulf of Pelusium. The map by Louis Figuier, in the Année scientifique et industrielle, which is French for Scientific and Industrial Year, Paris, Hachette, 1857, gives a distinct illustration of the formation of this land. Another statement, which occurs only in Strabo, finds also here a confirmation. Strabo alone, of all the Greek writers, relates that Nearchus, after he had landed his troops in the Persian Gulf, at the mouth of the Pasitigris, sailed out of the Persian Gulf by Alexander's command, and steered round Arabia through the Arabian Gulf. As the account stands, it is not clear what Nearchus had to do there, and what the object of the farther voyage was. If, as Strabo seems to think, it was only for geographical discovery, he need not have taken the whole fleet. 1 or 2 ships would have sufficed. We do not read that he returned. Where then did he remain with that fleet? The answer to this question is to be found in the Frisian version of the story. Alexander had bought the ships on the Indus, or had had them built by the descendants of the Frisians who settled there, the Geertmen, and had taken into his service sailors from among them, and at the head of them was Friso. Alexander, having accomplished his voyage and the transport of his troops, had no further use for the ships in the Persian Gulf, but wished to employ them in the Mediterranean. He had taken that idea into his head, and it must be carried into effect. He wished to do what no one had done before him. For this purpose, Nearchus was to sail up the Red Sea, and on his arrival at Suez was to find 200 elephants, 1,000 camels, workmen and materials, timber and ropes, in order to haul the ships by land over the isthmus. This work was carried on, and accomplished with so much zeal and energy, that after 3 months' labor the fleet was launched in the Mediterranean. That the fleet really came to the Mediterranean appears in Plutarch's Life of Alexander. But he makes Nearchus bring the fleet round Africa and sail through the Pillars of Hercules. After the defeat at Actium, Cleopatra, in imitation of this example, tried to take her fleet over the isthmus in order to escape to India, but was prevented by the inhabitants of Arabia Petraea, who burnt her ships. Source: Plutarch's Life of Antony. When Alexander, shortly afterwards, died, Friso remained in the service of Antigonus and Demetrius, until, having been grievously insulted by the latter, he resolved to seek out with his sailors their fatherland, Friesland. To India he could not indeed return. Thus these accounts chime in with, and clear up each other, and in that way afford a mutual confirmation of the events. Such simple narratives and surprising results led me to conclude that we had to do here with more than mere saga and legends. Since the last 20 years, attention has been directed to the remains of the dwellings on piles, first observed in the Swiss lakes, and afterwards in other parts of Europe. When they were found, endeavors were made to discover, by the existing fragments of arms, tools, and household articles, by whom and when these dwellings had been inhabited. There are no accounts of them in historical writers, beyond what Herodotus writes in Book 5, Chapter 18, of the Paeonin. The only trace that has been found is in one of the panels of Trajan's pillar, in which the destruction of a pile village in Dacia is represented. Doubly important, therefore, is it to learn from the writing of Apollonia that she, as Bergtmagd, chief of the virgins, about 540 years before Christ, made a journey up the Rhine to Switzerland, and there became acquainted with the lake dwellers, the Marsatten. She describes their dwellings built upon piles, the people themselves, their manners and customs. She relates that they lived by fishing and hunting, and that they prepared the skins of the animals with the bark of the birch tree in order to sell the fare to the Rhine boatmen, who brought them into commerce. This account of the pile dwellings in the Swiss lakes can only have been written in the time when these dwellings still existed and were lived in. In the second part of the writing, Konrad Oera Linda relates that Adele, the son of Friso, 250 years before Christ, visited the pile dwellings in Switzerland with his wife Ifkja. Later than this account, there is no mention by any writer whatever of the pile dwellings, and the subject has remained for 20 centuries utterly unknown. Until 1853, when an extraordinary low state of the water led to the discovery of these dwellings. Therefore, no one could have invented this account in the intervening period. Although a great portion of the first part of the work, the Book of Adele, belongs to the mythological period before the Trojan War, there is a striking difference between it and the Greek myths. The myths have no dates, much less any chronology, nor any internal coherence of successive events. The untrammeled fancy develops itself in every poem, separately and independently. The mythological stories contradict each other on every point. Myths do not hold true is the only key to the Greek mythology. Here, on the contrary, we meet with a regular succession of dates starting from a fixed period, the destruction of Atlant, 2193 before Christ. The accounts are natural and simple, often naive, never contradict each other, and are always consistent with each other in time and place. As for instance, the arrival and sojourn of Ulysses with the Bergt-Majd Calip at Wr-alda, which is the most mythical portion of all, is here said to be 1005 years after the disappearance of Atlant, which coincides with 1188 years before Christ, and thus agrees, very nearly, with the time at which the Greeks say the Trojan War took place. The story of Ulysses was not brought here for the first time by the Romans. Tacitus found it already in Lower Germany, and says that at Assaburgium there was an altar on which the names of Ulysses and his father Laertes were inscribed. Another remarkable difference consists in this, that the myths know no origin, do not name either writers or relators of their stories, and therefore never can bring forward any authority. Whereas in Adele's book, for every statement is given a notice where it was found, or whence it was taken. For instance, this comes from Minnow's writings. This is written on the walls of Warabirch. This in the town of Frya, this at Stavia, this at Wr-alda. There is also this further: laws, regular legislative enactments, such as are found in great numbers in Adele's book, are utterly unknown in mythology, and indeed are irreconcilable with its existence. Even when the myth attributes to Minos the introduction of law-giving in Crete, it does not give the least account of what the legislation consisted in. Also, among the gods of mythology, there existed no system of laws. The only law was unchangeable destiny, and the will of the supreme Zeus. With regard to mythology, this writing, which bears no mythical character, is not less remarkable than with regard to history, notwithstanding the frequent and various relations with Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. We do not find any traces of acquaintance with the Northern or Scandinavian mythology. Only Woden appears in the person of Woden, a chief of the Frisians, who became the son-in-law of one Magi, king of the Finns, and after his death was deified. The Frisian religion is extremely simple and pure monotheism. Wr-alda, or Wr-alda's spirit, is the only eternal, unchangeable, perfect, and almighty being. Wr-alda has created everything. Out of him proceeds everything. First, the beginning, then time, and afterwards, Eartha, spelled I-R-T-H-A, the earth. Irtha bore 3 daughters, Lida, Finda, and Frya, the mothers of the 3 distinct races, black, yellow, and white, Africa, Asia, and Europe. As such, Frya is the mother of Frya's people, the Frieslanders. She is the representative of Wr-alda, and is reverenced accordingly. Frya has established her texts, the first law, and has established the religion of the eternal light. The worship consists in the maintenance of a perpetually burning lamp, Fodik, by priestesses, virgins. At the head of the virgins, in every town was a Burgtmajd, and the chief of the Burgtmajden was the Iramoder of the Friasburgt of Texland. The Iramoder governs the whole country. The kings can do nothing, nor can anything happen without her advice and approval. The first Iramoder was appointed by Frya herself, and was called Fasta. In fact, we find here the prototype of the Roman Vestal Virgins. If we find among the Frisians a belief in a godhead, and ideas of religion, entirely different from the mythology of other nations, we are the more surprised to find in some points the closest connection with the Greek and Roman mythology, and even with the origin of 2 deities of the highest rank, Minerva and Neptune. Minerva, Athene, was originally a Burgtmajd, priestess of Frya, at the town Walhalagara, Middelburg, or Domburg, in Walcheren. And this Minerva is at the same time the mysterious, enigmatical goddess, of whose worship scarcely any traces remain beyond the votive stones at Domburg in Walcheren, Nehelenia, of whom no mythology knows anything more than the name, which etymology has used for all sorts of fantastical derivations. The other, Neptune, called by the Etrurians Nethunus, the god of the Mediterranean Sea, appears here to have been, when living, a Friesland Viking, or sea king, whose home was Alderga, Audorp, not far from Alkmaar. His name was Tunis, called familiarly by his followers Neef Tunis, or Cousin Tunis, who had chosen the Mediterranean as the destination of his expeditions, and must have been deified by the Tyrians, at the time when the Phoenician navigators began to extend their voyages so remarkably, sailing to Friesland in order to obtain British tin, northern iron, and amber from the Baltic, about 2,000 years before Christ. Besides these 2, we meet with a third mythological person, Minos, the lawgiver of Crete, who likewise appears to have been a Friesland sea king. Minno, born at Lindaord, between Wieringen and Krail, who imparted to the Cretans an Asagabok. He is that Minos who, with his brother Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, presided as judges over the fates of the ghosts in Hades, and must not be confounded with the later Minos, the contemporary of Aegeus and Theseus, who appears in the Athenian fables. The reader may perhaps be inclined to laugh at these statements, and apply to me the words that I myself have lately used, fantastic and improbable. Indeed, at first I could not believe my own eyes, and yet, after further consideration, I arrived at the discovery of extraordinary conformities, which render the case much less improbable than the birth of Minerva from the head of Jupiter, by a blow from the axe of Hephaestus, for instance. In the Greek mythology, all the gods and goddesses have a youthful period. Pallas alone has no youth. She is not otherwise known than adult. Minerva appears in Attica as high priestess from a foreign country, a country unknown to the Greeks. Pallas is a virgin goddess. Minerva is a Burgtmajd. The fair, blue-eyed Pallas, differing thus in type from the rest of the gods and goddesses, evidently belonged to Frya's people. The character for wisdom and the emblematical attributes, especially the owl, are the same for both. Pallas gives to the new town her own name, Athenae, which has no meaning in Greek. Minerva gives to the town built by her the name Athene, which has an important meaning in Frise, namely that they came there as friends, Athen. Minerva came to Attica about 1600 years before Christ. the period at which the Grecian mythology was beginning to be formed. Minerva landed with the fleet of John at the head of a colony in Attica. In later times, we find her on the Roman votive stones in Walcheren, under the name of Nehelenia, worshipped as a goddess of navigation. And Pallas is worshipped by the Athenians as the protecting goddess of shipbuilding and navigation. Time is the carrier who must eternally turn the wheel, and carry the sun along his course through the firmament from winter to winter, thus forming the year, every turn of the wheel being a day. In midwinter, the Yule feast is celebrated on Frya's day. Then cakes are baked in the form of the sun's wheel, because with the Yule, Frya formed the letters when she wrote her texts. The Yule feast is therefore also in honor of Frya, as inventor of writing. Just as this Yule feast has been changed by Christianity into Christmas throughout Denmark and Germany, and into St. Nicholas's Day in Holland, so certainly are St. Nicholas dolls, the lover and his sweetheart, are a memorial of Frya, and the St. Nicholas letters a memorial of Frya's invention of letters formed from the wheel. I cannot analyze the whole contents of this writing, and must content myself with the remarks that I have made. They will give an idea of the richness and importance of the contents. If some of it is fabulous, even as fabulous, it must have an interest for us, since so little of the traditions of our forefathers remains to us. An internal evidence of the antiquity of these writings may be found in the fact that the name Batavians had not yet been used. The inhabitants of the whole country, as far as the Scheldt, are Frya's people, Frieslanders. The Batavians are not a separate people. The name Batavi is of Roman origin. The Romans gave it to the inhabitants of the banks of the Wal, which river bears the name Patibus in the Tabula Pentingeriana. The name Batavi does not appear earlier than Tacitus and Pliny, and is interpolated in Caesar's Bello Gallico. I will conclude with one more remark regarding the language. Those who have been able to take only a superficial view of the manuscript have been struck by the polish of the language and its conformity with the present Friesland language and Dutch. In this, they seem to find grounds for doubting the antiquity of the manuscript. But I ask, is then the language of Homer much less polished than that of Plato or Demosthenes? And does not the greatest portion of Homer's vocabulary exist in the Greek of our day? It is true that language alters with time and is continually subject to slight variations, owing to which language is found to be different at different epochs. This change in the language in this manuscript accordingly gives ground for important observations to philologists. It is not only that of the 8 writers who have successively worked at the book. Each is recognizable by slight peculiarities in style, language, and spelling, but more particularly between the 2 parts of the book, between which an interval of more than 2 centuries occurs. A striking difference of the language is visible, which shows what a slowly progressive regulation it has undergone in that period of time. As the result of these considerations, I arrive at the conclusion that I cannot find any reason to doubt the authenticity of these writings. They cannot be forgeries. In the first place, the copy of 1256 cannot be. Who could, at that time, have forged anything of that kind? Certainly no one, still less anyone at an earlier date. At a later date, a forgery is equally impossible, for the simple reason that no one was acquainted with the language. Except Grimm, Richthofen, and Hedema, no one can be named sufficiently versed in that branch of philology, or who had studied the language so as to be able to write in it. And if anyone could have done so, there would have been no more extensive vocabulary at his service than that which the East Frisian laws afford. Therefore, in the centuries lately elapsed, the preparation of this writing was quite impossible. Whoever doubts this, let him begin by showing where, when, by whom, and with what object such a forgery could be committed, and let him show in modern times the fellow of this paper, this writing, and this language. Moreover, That the manuscript of 1256 is not original, but is a copy, is proved by the numerous faults in the writing, as well as by some explanations of words, which already in the time of the copyist had become obsolete and little known. We may thus accept that we possess in this manuscript, of which the first part was composed in the 6th century before our era, the oldest production, after Homer and Hesiod, of European literature. And here we find in our fatherland a very ancient people in possession of development, civilization, industry, navigation, commerce, literature, and pure elevated ideas of religion, whose existence we had never even conjectured. Hitherto we have believed that the historical records of our people reach no farther back than the arrival of Friso, the presumptive founder of the Frisians, whereas here we become aware that these records mount up to more than 2,000 years before Christ, surpassing the antiquity of Hellas, and equaling that of Israel. This paper was read at a meeting of the Frisian Society, February 1871.
A reading of the Oera Linda Book by William R. Sandbach, 1876. Produced and edited by 31 Pearls, all rights reserved. The letter. Okke, my son, you must preserve these books, with body and soul. They contain the history of all our people, as well as of our forefathers. Last year I saved them in the flood, as well as you and your mother, but they got wet, and therefore began to perish. In order not to lose them, I copied them on foreign paper. In case you inherit them, you must copy them likewise, and your children must do so too, so that they may never be lost. Written at Lowert in the 3449th year after Atlantis was submerged. That is, according to the Christian reckoning, the year 1256, which is 1,093 years before Christ. Hiddo surnamed Oera Linda. Watch. Beloved successors, for the sake of our dear forefathers and of our dear liberty, I entreat you 1,000 times, never let the eye of a monk look on these writings. They are very insinuating, but they destroy, in an underhand manner, all that relates to us Frisians. In order to gain rich benefices, they conspire with foreign kings, who know that we are their greatest enemies, because we dare to speak to their people of liberty, rights, and the duties of princes. Therefore they seek to destroy all that we derive from our forefathers, and all that is left of our old customs. Ah, my beloved ones, I have visited their courts. If Wr-alda permits it, and we do not chew ourselves strong to resist, they will altogether exterminate us. Signed, Lico, surnamed Oera Linda. Written at Lodroert, Anno Domini, 803. The Book of Adele's followers. 30 years after the day on which the Volksmutter was murdered by the commander Magi was a time of great distress. All the states that lie on the other side of the Weser had been wrested from us, and had fallen under the power of Magi, and it looked as if his power was to become supreme over the whole land. To avert this misfortune, a general assembly of the people was summoned, which was attended by all the men who stood in good repute with the Majden, the priestesses. Then at the end of 3 days, the whole council was in confusion, and in the same position as when they came together. Thereupon Adele demanded to be heard and said, "You all know that I was 3 years burgmaged. You know also that I was chosen for Volksmutter, and that I refused to be Volksmutter, because I wished to marry a Pole. But what you do not know is, that I have watched everything that has happened, as if I had really been your Volksmutter. I have constantly traveled about, observing what was going on. By that means I have become acquainted with many things that others do not know. You said yesterday that our relatives on the other side of the Weser were dull and cowardly, but I may tell you that the Magi has not won a single village from them by force of arms, but only by detestable deceit, and still more by the rapacity of their dukes and nobles. Frya has said we must not admit amongst us any but free people. But what have they done? They have imitated our enemies, and instead of killing their prisoners, or letting them go free, they have despised the council of Frya, and have made slaves of them. Because they have acted thus, Frya cared no longer to watch over them. They robbed others of their freedom, and therefore lost their own. This is well known to you. But I will tell you how they came to sink so low. The Finn women had children. These grew up with our free children. They played and gambled together in the fields, and were also together by the hearth. There they learned with pleasure the loose ways of the Finns, because they were bad, and new, and thus they became denationalized in spite of the efforts of their parents. When the children grew up, and saw that the children of the Finns handled no weapons, and scarcely worked, they took a distaste for work and became proud. The principal men and their cleverest sons made up to the wanton daughters of the Finns, and their own daughters, led astray by this bad example, allowed themselves to be beguiled by the handsome young Finns in derision of their depraved fathers. When the Magi found this out, he took the handsomest of his Finns and Magyars, and promised them red cows with golden horns to let themselves be taken prisoners by our people, in order to spread his doctrines. His people did even more. Children disappeared, were taken away to the uplands, and after they had been brought up in his pernicious doctrines, were sent back. When these pretended prisoners had learned our language, they persuaded the dukes and nobles that they should become subject to the Magi, that then their sons would succeed to them, without having to be elected. Those who, by their good deeds, had gained a piece of land in front of their house, they promised on their side should receive, in addition, a piece behind. Those who had got a piece before and behind should have a rondel, a complete circuit, and those who had a rondel should have a whole freehold. If the seniors were true to Frya, then they changed their course and turned to the degenerate sons. Yesterday there were among you those who would have called the whole people together, to compel the eastern states to return to their duty. According to my humble opinion, they would have made a great mistake. Suppose that there was a very serious epidemic among the cattle. Would you run the risk of sending your own healthy cattle among the sick ones? Certainly not. Everyone must see that doing that would turn out very badly for the whole of the cattle. Who, then, would be so imprudent as to send their children among a people wholly depraved? If I were to give you any advice, it would be to choose a new volksmotor. I know that you are in a difficulty about it, because out of the 13 Bergmageddon that we still have remaining, 8 are candidates for the dignity, but I should pay no attention to that. Tontia, the Bergmagd of Medea's Blick, who is not a candidate, is a person of knowledge and sound sense, and quite as attached to our people and our customs as all the rest together. I should further recommend that you should visit all the citadels, and write down all the laws of Frya's texts, as well as all the histories, and all that is written on the walls, in order that it may not be destroyed with the citadels. It stands written, that every volksmotor and every Bergmagd shall have assistants and messengers, 21 maidens and 7 apprentices. If I might add more, I would recommend that all the respectable girls in the towns should be taught, for I say positively, and time will show it, that if you wish to remain true children of Frya, never to be vanquished by fraud or arms, you must take care to bring up your daughters as true Frya's daughters. You must teach the children how great our country has been, what great men our forefathers were, how great we still are, if we compare ourselves to others. You must tell them of the sea heroes, of their mighty deeds and distant voyages. All these stories must be told by the fireside and in the field, wherever it may be in times of joy or sorrow, and if you wish to impress it on the brains and the hearts of your sons, you must let it flow through the lips of your wives and your daughters. Adele's advice was followed. These are the Grevitmen, under whose direction this book is composed. Apol, Adele's husband, 3 times a sea king. Grevitmen of Ostflyland and Linda Orden. The towns Loedgarda, Lindahem, and Stavia are under his care. The Saxman Storo, Sitia's husband. Grevitman over the Hugafenin and Wooden. 9 times he was chosen as duke, or heerman, or commander. The towns Buda and Managarda Forda are under his care. Abelo, Yaltia's husband. Grevitman over the Zuiderflylanden. He was 3 times heerman. The towns Aachen, Ludberg, and Katzberg are under his care. Enoch, Brejuica's husband. Grevitman over Westflyland and Texel. He was chosen 9 times for sea king. Waraberg, Medeasblick, Forana, and Friasberg are under his care. Foppa, Dunru's husband. Grevitman over the 7 islands. He was 5 times sea king. The town Walhalagara is under his care. This was inscribed upon the walls of Friasberg, in Texland, as well as at Stavia and Medeasblick. It was Frya's day, and 7 times 7 years had elapsed, since Festa was appointed folksmoter by the desire of Frya. The citadel of Medeasblick was ready, and a Bergmagd was chosen. Festa was about to light her new lamp, and when she had done so in the presence of all the people, Frya called from her watchstar, so that everyone could hear it. Festa, take your style and write the things that I may not speak. Festa did as she was bid, and thus we became Frya's children, and our earliest history began. This is our earliest history. Wr-alda, which means old ancient or oldest being, who alone is eternal and good, made the beginning. Then commenced time. Time wrought all things, even the earth. The earth bore grass, herbs, and trees, all useful and all noxious animals. All that is good and useful she brought forth by day, and all that is bad and injurious by night. After the 12th jewel feast she brought forth 3 maidens, Lida, out of fierce heat, Finda out of strong heat, Frya out of moderate heat. When the last came into existence, Wr-alda breathed his spirit upon her, in order that men might be bound to him. As soon as they were full grown, they took pleasure and delight in the visions of Wr-alda. Hatred found its way among them. They each bore 12 sons and 12 daughters. At every jewel time a couple. Thence come all mankind. Lida was black, with hair curled like a lamb's. Her eyes shone like stars, and shot out glances like those of a bird of prey. Lida was acute. She could hear a snake glide and could smell a fish in the water. Lida was strong and nimble. She could bend a large tree, yet when she walked, she did not bruise a flower stalk. Lida was violent. Her voice was loud, and when she screamed in anger, every creature quailed. Wonderful Lida. She had no regard for laws. Her actions were governed by her passions. To help the weak, she would kill the strong, and when she had done it, she would weep by their bodies. Poor Lida. She turned gray by her mad behavior, and at last she died heartbroken by the wickedness of her children. Foolish children. They accused each other of their mother's death. They howled and fought like wolves, and while they did this, the birds devoured the corpse. Who can refrain from tears at such a recital? Finda was yellow, and her hair was like the mane of a horse. She could not bend a tree, but where Lida killed 1 lion, she killed 10. Finda was seductive. Her voice was sweeter than any bird's. Her eyes were alluring and enticing, but whoever looked upon them became her slave. Fantasical was unreasonable. She wrote thousands of laws, but she never obeyed one. She despised the frankness of the good and gave herself up to flatterers. That was her misfortune. Her head was too full, but her heart was too vain. She loved nobody but herself, and she wished that all should love her. False Fantasical, honey-sweet were her words, but those who trusted them found sorrow at hand. Selfish Fantasical, she wished to rule everybody, and her sons were like her. They made their sisters serve them, and they slew each other for the mastery. Treacherous Fantasical. One wrong word would irritate her, and the cruelest deeds did not affect her. If she saw a lizard swallow a spider, she shuddered, but if she saw her children kill a Frisian, her bosom swelled with pleasure. Unfortunate Fantasical. She died in the bloom of her age, and the mode of her death is unknown. Hypocritical children. Her corpse was buried under a costly stone, pompous inscriptions were written on it, and loud lamentations were heard at it, but in private not a tear was shed. Despicable people. The laws that Fantasical established were written on golden tables, but the object for which they were made was never attained. The good laws were abolished, and selfishness instituted bad ones in their place. Oh, Fantasical. Then the earth overflowed with blood, and your children were mown down like grass. Yes, Fantasical, those were the fruits of your vanity. Look down from your watchstar and weep. Frya was white like the snow at sunrise, and the blue of her eyes vied with the rainbow. Beautiful Frya, like the rays of the sun, shone the locks of her hair, which were as fine as spiders' webs. Clever Frya. When she opened her lips, the birds ceased to sing and the leaves to quiver. Powerful Frya. At the glance of her eye, the lion lay down at her feet, and the adder withheld his poison. Pure Frya. Her food was honey, and her beverage was dew gathered from the cups of the flowers. Sensible Frya. The first lesson that she taught her children was self-control, and the second was the love of virtue. And when they were grown, she taught them the value of liberty. For she said, "Without liberty all other virtues serve to make you slaves, and to disgrace your origin." Generous Frya. She never allowed metal to be dug from the earth for her own benefit, but when she did it, it was for the general use. Most happy Frya. Like the starry host in the firmament, her children clustered around her. Wise Frya. When she had seen her children reach the 7th generation, she summoned them all to Flyland, and there gave them her text saying, "Let this be your guide, and it can never go ill with you." Exalted Frya. When she had thus spoken, the earth shook like the sea of Wr-alda. The ground of Flyland sank beneath her feet. The air was dimmed by tears, and when they looked for their mother, she was already risen to her watching star. Then at length thunder burst from the clouds, and the lightning wrote upon the firmament, "Watch." Far-seeing Frya. The land from which she had risen was now a stream, and except her text, all that was in it was overwhelmed. Obedient children. When they came to themselves again, they made this high mound and built this citadel upon it, and on the walls they wrote the texts, and that everyone should be able to find it, they called the land about it Textland. Therefore it shall remain as long as the earth shall be the earth.